Welcome back to this episode number 9 of the DCC Insider Podcast. Today, we are so blessed and lucky to have with us Mr. Paul Stuligross, class of 85? 82.
I wish it was 85.
Yeah, I wish it was 85. 82 with us, a Novi police officer turned theology teacher. And today, we want to understand why. You know, why that big transformation, why the shift, and why you feel called to teaching the faith to students. So
I kind of went through a transitional period, probably about 5 to 7 years after I was at the police department. And, it was, I wouldn't say that I walked away from my faith, but being a police officer can be very challenging to your faith. And what I noticed was that there's this dichotomy. There was either officers that were very much into their faith or officers that were not at all into it. And it's because it's the type of job where you face a lot of suffering, you see a lot of sorrow, and it makes you question God's goodness, God's existence. And so about 5 years into it, I said, what type of officer do I want to be? If I'm not really living my faith, then I need to. I went to Catholic Central. I went to Catholic schools my whole life. But what happens is you get into this big world, and the world gets thrown at you, and the secularism gets thrown at you, and you start to drift a little bit. And so I got back into my faith about 5, 6, 7 years after I was at the police department, and really started getting my faith. And what I thought was going to happen, after I got into my faith, I thought God was going to allow me to leave that toxic environment and maybe get into something less toxic. And what I found that wasn't what happened. I believe God wanted me in the police department as a solid Catholic man so that I could bring light into a situation that otherwise didn't have it. And so I stayed there. I got married. After I was a detective for a few years. I got married a little bit later in life, had a couple daughters, and I'm glad that I had the opportunity to kind of readjust my faith life, because you could see in the police department, and I think Mr. Zabel would agree with me, you could see officers who maintain a strong faith and strong values and family values, and you could compare that with officers who did not. And it was often disastrous for officers that did not. And I in my own way, I said to myself, I don't want that for my family. I became a detective I was about early 30s, and then I met my wife a few years after that. And then I had my first daughter, and I was a juvenile detective at the time. And I didn't have a ton of cases, not as many as the guy after me did, but I had enough child abuse cases where I said, I can't do it. I can't. It was just very difficult for me to do. So I stepped down from that, and it was better for family life. I came back to the road, and I knew I had my eyes set on something I wanted to do later on in life. So I was discerning two things. I discerned becoming a deacon, and I discerned becoming a Catholic school teacher. And I opted for the second because it allowed me more time with my family. I'd been away from them a lot with weekends and nights and things like that. And I knew that this afforded me the ability to teach the faith, but to do it in an atmosphere that was conducive to family life. And my original intent was to get a job teaching at an all-girls school. I have 2 daughters. Tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor, right? So I worked at Ladywood for a few years, Ladywood High School, with the thought that my daughters would go there. Unfortunately, the school ended up closing. I went back to St. Mary's of Orchard Lake, and I was there for about 7 years. And finally, I'm back in my alma mater. I feel like I'm home finally. So it was something I really felt called to do.
You said you're a CC alum, and we're taught always GDK. How would you say, as a police officer and as a detective, you brought GDK to your station and to the people you helped protect and all of that?
Well, the fact of the matter is I probably didn't the first couple of years.
Okay.
Because you get involved in different lines of work, and even though I had that basis to me because I went to Catholic Central, and I had the formation of the Basilian priests and formation of my grade school. I went to Catholic grade school as well. It didn't really sit with me until a few years into the police department. But then after a while, I started to realize that I had to, if I was going to be a man of faith, I had to live it. And just 1 hour a week on Sundays wasn't going to do it. If I was going to live it, I had to live it in the way that I not only acted at church, but the way that I acted at the police department, the way I treated suspects, the way I treated my fellow officers, and ultimately the way I treated my family. And I think that with this specific type of a job, it can carry you away very quickly. You have a lot of power, you have a lot of authority, and if you're not grounded in that, it can go to your head. All you have to do is watch the news to see how that's happened. And so what I started to realize was, and this is what when I became a field training officer, one of the first pieces of advice that I would give young officers is I would tell them, don't think for a minute that your kids or your wife are impressed by what you do. To you, you're just dad. And so if you come home with that bravado and you think that you're going to act a certain way around your wife and your kids, it's not going to go well. To you, it may sound silly, you're daddy. And so you need to be willing to roll up your sleeves and be dad, not officer dad, when you come home. And so I think GDK and the family values that Catholic Central espouses kind of blossomed in me during those years, and I was able to do that.
So
hopefully,
I have some family members, public service industry and such like that, that go out and put their lives on the line every day. How do you tie that into your faith? Because when you walked out the door in the morning, you had to put your trust in a higher power and say to your wife, say to your kids, I have to do this job. This is what I have to do.
That's a good question. I think the interesting thing is that most officers want to become officers because secretly they have this superhero desire. And I think that's true of all young men today. There's a reason I think that superhero movies are so popular. It's because it sparks within us that desire to be heroes. And so when I went into the police department, my desire was to kind of become that savior. The problem is that you can't become the savior without the savior. And I think a lot of times we try to do that. We try to be that hero without relying on the greatest hero, who in my opinion is Jesus Christ. And I don't say that in a flighty or an uppity way. I say that in a real way. I think, and it took me a couple of years to recognize that I'm here in this position and I have the ability to really change people's lives, to help people, to save people. You're not just an officer, you're a counselor, you're a surrogate parent, you're a lot of different roles in that role. But I think we overlook the ability to become more heroic through our connection with the Savior. And that's something we can tend to overlook from time to time. Does that kind of answer?
Yes, of course it does. Yeah. And I think that having faith behind anything you do, no matter what career you're in, I think is a guiding force, but especially in a career where you're literally putting your life on the line every day to take care of other people. And I don't personally feel that there's any higher call than that, honestly, is putting your life on the line. So we do appreciate you for that.
No, I appreciate it. There's a lot. I worked with a lot of brave men and women. I did. Luckily, I didn't have too many close calls with that, but I know people that did, and so I say, and I was really they kind of pumped me up. So I work with some great people, great individuals.
How has your experience as an officer and a detective helped build your persona as a now high school theology teacher, moral theology teacher, and that matter?
I think in order to reach students, you have to come down from the over theologizing, and you have to put it on a level that is more real. And so I think, certainly we have to cover certain things in moral theology, certain church teachings. But I think the best classes that I've had are the classes where you can shut the laptops down and just have a conversation. Just talk about the impact that sin has in people's lives and what you've seen as an officer. I mean, I think there's nothing that teaches you more about the importance of God than seeing the lack of God in people's lives. And you saw a lot of that. And that's not to say that bad things don't happen to good people, because they do. But I've said oftentimes that as an officer, I would go to a tragic scenario twice in one shift. Very similar tragedy. Someone maybe has died, and you walk into one home and you see angst and unforgiveness and just a bitter suffering. And then you walk into the other home and you see forgiveness and empathy and love. They go through the same tragedies, but how is it that one family can walk through that tragedy with such dignity and another family sees such sorrow? And every time it was because they had their faith. And so witnessing that as an officer, I've kind of hoped that I could bring that to the classroom and just kind of be more real with the guys in the classroom in what I've seen and how that has impacted me. And I think if you can do that, and by also being, I think, transparent, by being open and saying, I've made my share of mistakes in my life, and here's what they are. And I tell you guys this so that maybe you don't make the same mistakes.
And I think that you've kind of become a little bit of a legend over the past couple of years, on campus for that, because you're the first teacher that I've ever had to open up real cases and show real photos and show this is what happens, and this is life, and this is what happens if you go down that path. And I think that those have been some of the most, like your class, and I've told other people before, first class my entire school career that I didn't look at the clock when I was sitting there. Honestly. And I know I don't think I've ever told you that before, but first class I went in, I sat down, I never looked at the clock because I enjoyed every single moment in there. And having the opportunity to see real cases, to see what people experience, and then at the end of it, to predict kind of what we thought was going on in their lives at the time.
Right.
And
really
sometimes our predictions were wrong. And that was the scary part, was some of these stories were no different than us. And their live stories started out no different than our life story started out. And so It shows things can change in an instant. And
they can, and I think I think what it shows is that, we can look at moral law as law, or we can look at moral law as God's perspective. If we look at it as law, we're less likely to want to follow it because nobody wants to be told what to do as we get older, right? Mm-hmm. But if we look at it as God's wisdom and perspective, then we take a step back and say, maybe this is good for me. And that's the way I've always tried to look at it. We have this Old Testament view of God, that God's always angry with us and God's always disappointed in us. And I don't think that's true. After I've become a parent, I've realized that God is probably revels in our presence more than we recognize. And yet we're always looking at our sins. We're looking at the wrong that we've done. And so that's impacted me as a parent too. It's helped me be a parent to daughters, Never grew up with any sisters, so this is kind of a new thing.
Foreign thing for you.
Yeah, foreign thing for me.
Uh-huh.
So going back a little bit, you said you were a detective and then you started training fellow officers.
Right.
Were you detective and then you started training fellow officers because you had that more experience, or
So,
how did that play out?
So when I got hired on, at the time when I got promoted to detective, it was a promotion, and then for whatever reason there was a shift in the contract, and it was considered then it was an appointment. But I was grandfathered, and I could have stayed a detective to the end of my career. Towards the end of my time in the detective bureau, I was a juvenile detective for about 2 years. So you're dealing with child sexual abuse and things like that.
Okay.
Crimes committed by kids or crimes committed to kids. And it was right around the same time that I had my daughters. And so I was lucky. I didn't have as many cases as the guy who took my place, who just an incredible detective, took my place. A couple of guys took my place. And they had a ton of cases. But even some that I had, it impacted you because you see the face of your own child in some of these cases. So my wife could always tell when I had a rough day at work because I'd call her at home and say, how are the girls doing? Give them a big hug for me. And she knew. So between that and the scheduling and getting called out all the time, I wanted to be home more often. And so I opted to go back to road patrol. And everybody told me at the police department, this is career suicide. You're never going to. But at the time I said, at the end, my kids aren't going to care that I was a captain. My kids are going to, or was I there for them? So I came back to the road. I prayed about it. I really did pray hard about it. And I felt as though I'd be called to come back to road patrol because we worked 12-hour shifts then. It allowed me more time, and I went back to get my master's degree at Sacred Heart Seminary. So when I went back, they approached me and asked me if I would be a field training officer. It's probably because of the experience. So I was a field training officer, and then I became the chaplain liaison, where we didn't have a chaplain's corps at the police department, so we started a chaplain's corps, hired a couple chaplains, and then I trained them. I put them through some training, and we went essentially from, well, we had really one, but we went from 1 to about 6 different chaplains, and then we put them on an on-call list, and they'd come in and ride around the police cars and things like that. So I was field training officer to new officers that came out of the academy, and they would ride with me during a certain sequence of time, and there were 3 steps. They'd have to ride with 3 different training officers, and then they'd go out on their own. They'd be on probation for a year, and then they were fine after that.
So, in terms of the chaplain's corps that you developed, what were some of the duties that they would take part in on the daily basis?
They weren't full-time chaplains. They were just, we had a Catholic priest, we had a couple of Baptist ministers, we had I believe we had a Jewish rabbi that was part of it as well. So they were on call for about 2 weeks at a time, and they would come in if there was a death notification.
Okay.
They'd come in, they'd come right to the house, and they would give the notification, be there for people. And or they'd come in and ride with the policeman. And the funny thing is about the chaplain's corps is that they were there just as much for the officers as they were for the citizens. And what they would find is they'd ride around in the police car with officers, and at first the officers would be very tentative. They wouldn't say anything because they felt like they had to be on their best behavior. But the most successful chaplains that I saw were the ones that could really roll up their sleeves and just be real. And I'll just tell you, one of the first things I did when I trained new chaplains is I brought them in, I sat them down, and then I played a 911 tape that I got a hold of that happened at our department. I don't know if I can talk about this on this, but I will anyway. Where there was a older man that was stabbing his wife to death during the 911 tape. And you could hear everything going on in the background. Why are you doing this? And he's stabbing her. And you could see the look on the chaplain's face of look of disgust and look of just distastefulness. And then I stopped the tape. And then I said to the chaplains, so the officer that responds to this call and sees this happening, when they come back to the station and they say some bad words and they're all stressed out and they're swearing, does that make them a bad person? And they all said, well, no, it doesn't. And at that point in time, I said, you know what? You've just passed the first lesson. Because when you see that stuff firsthand, and I have to just give a shout out to my wife. When I would come home and I would be venting about what happened to me at work today, she was never judgmental. In fact, she'd jump on my side. Yeah, I don't blame you for feeling that way. Yeah, good for you. Yeah, that person was, and then after I was able to vent, I could take a step back and say, I feel better about that. So that was very, very helpful. And so with the chaplain corps, we tried to make them as down to earth. And to me, that's what's so great about so many of the bazillion priests I've met here. They're just down to earth guys that recognize their need to be right down there in the trenches with the students. And I think that's a very important place to be. That's what Christ did. That's what made him so successful.
I think that stands out to me the most about the Catholic faith and the priesthood and deaconship specifically is because we're not perfect, all right? And I think that a lot of people that are outside of the Catholic Church and outside of CC specifically to have this air about, we have to be in their best behavior all the time. That's not how it is. A priest first and foremost is meant to serve their parish, right? It's meant to serve the livelihoods, of their members of their parish, and specifically here, serve the students. And so they show up in some of the worst situations in people's lives, and they have to be the superhero at that point. We had a priest from St. Thomas earlier this school year that came in to speak to us, and he said, I love my job every day because I get to be a superhero, and I get to be a real life superhero. And I think that it goes hand in hand in the same situation because, police officers have to show up for the worst of the worst calls in the worst of the worst situations, and they're people too, And
You bring up a good point, and I want to touch on something there, because the funny thing is, when the chaplains corps, there were more than one time when I'd have a chaplain riding with me. We'd go into a volatile situation, and we'd walk into the home, and the person would be dropping F-bombs at me.
Mhm.
But then as soon as the priest walked in,
it would be,
hello, Father. How are you today?
Yeah.
And I'm like, can I borrow your towel sometime? That's ridiculous. Come on, what's up with that? And that happened a lot. And so, I've had some priest friends over the years, and in parishes, and I would reckon that, or I would think that maybe parish work is probably, I don't know, but parish work is a little different than working in a school, I would think. Some good, some bad. But I would tell my friend at the parish, I said, you see people at their best most of the time. He goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, here's what happens. They're driving to church in the car, yelling and screaming at each other and fighting about this. And as soon as they walk through the doors of the parish, they see the priest. Hello, Father. How are you?
That's funny.
Oh, I'm so blessed today, right?
Yeah.
I said, that's not reality.
Uh-huh.
See, they're fighting. And so I would see them at their worst.
Yep.
People rarely wanted to see me at their house. If you were there, you were either giving a death notification, which was the worst, or you were there because you were there to arrest somebody or something like that, or they got something stolen. So, good point. Yeah.
You've mentioned a lot of things, and with all this craziness happening in the world today, and would you argue that it's because of a lack of God in the world today?
I think that's 100%. I think that's 100% true. If you take a look at some of the tragedies today, the shootings, and this is going to sound a little crazy. I think there's some, I don't know if you want to edit this out or not, but I think there's a lot of demonic stuff going on in the world today. And there's a lot of things that they can't find motives for. And Mr. Zabik and I have talked about this numerous times. There were times that we would go into a situation. I was only involved in 7 homicides in my police career. I can't tell you how many suicides I've been to. I literally lost count. And we know that mental illness is a real thing, and we have to embrace that and understand that. And I think it's so great that this school recognizes that, especially with teens today. But I also think that there's also a spiritual aspect to that. And I think that as we move as a culture further away from God, the instances of depression and mental illness have gone up exponentially. And I think there's something to that. I'm not saying we need to ignore the mental illness and the medical side of that, because that's a real side, and that's a very real thing. But I don't think we can ignore the spiritual aspect of that as well, because that plays into it. And I think the more hope we have, the easier it is to lift ourselves up from sometimes those doldrums. And when we have no God, and we drift away from God, there's just this loss of hope that I think permeates our culture.
How would you say we could help that or make it better?
I think the number one thing we can do is exactly what we're doing at this school.
Okay.
To form young men, so that I always tell my students, get your spiritual crap together now. Before you become a husband, before you become a father, before you become a priest, before you become a CEO, so that you can be whole and make your family whole. We have this whole culture today of young people that are constantly trying to find fulfillment in relationships rather than in God. And I don't say that in a Pollyannish way where God expects us to walk around with our hands full at all. I mean in a real way. What I found for me, and I'm not perfect at it, I'm far from perfect, is that oftentimes, and I'm kind of diverting here, oftentimes I'm very patient with you guys, but then I'm not patient with my own kids when I get home. I'm patient with everybody here, but by the time I get home, I'm exhausted. And so what I've had to do myself is, more than once, is go into the chapel and say, God, you got to fill me up. You got to make me better at this. And he's done that every time I've asked him to do that. And so I think the number one thing we can do is start at home. Start by becoming the type of man you want to become today, so that you can build on that and you're stronger, so that you can give more to your wife, to your kids. And I think if we can build stronger families, ultimately we'll have stronger communities.
And
That's
you know,
beautiful.
it's so true. And we talked about this year with Mr. Mahalik, and actually you came in to speak on the topic too as well after. But we talked about the lack of masculinity that exists in our country right now, and you know, men don't have a clear structure and a clear figure to look up to in this society. Is you know, kind of what we discussed, and I think there's seriously some truth to that, because faith and being a strong man and finding that path that's right for you is so key. And it's so key to building the future, I think.
If the devil's going to take down a family, who better to take down than the general of that family?
100%.
Indeed.
100%.
That's 100%
Yep.
true.
100%.
And I think, and that goes, and there's a lot of kids out there that may not have that strong father figure.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved, before I was married, in a lot of mentorship, mentored a number of kids from the inner city who didn't have that light. And so I would say the second thing you can do, I'm a big advocate of the Big Brother program. You know, when you get old, you get some time on your hands, take a kid out and mentor them. Because, you know, some of us have some we're blessed to have, you know, older men in our lives that showed us the way. That doesn't mean all of us do.
Exactly.
And that's even true in this school. And so we need to recognize that there are some young men. And so I would say to the older people here, to the older seniors, if you want to be a hero, I mean this from the bottom of my heart, instead of picking on the freshman, look at the kid that doesn't have anybody to sit with. Go spend some extra time, pull him into the conversation. And I've even had kids in my class here that are just quiet, you know, just kind of reserved. And then you spend some time just asking them, how's it going? What are you doing this weekend? And you see them kind of lift up out of their seats. Someone took the time to talk to me, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think you can start to be heroes today as upperclassmen by just taking a freshman, taking a sophomore, even a sophomore under your belt, and just showing them some extra attention.
Who's your favorite superhero?
My favorite superhero growing up? Batman.
Batman.
Even
Great
though
choice.
technically
Great
he
choice.
doesn't have any superpowers, though, right? But I watched the old Batman show. The older teachers probably remember the Batman series on TV, the reruns. And yeah, Batman was probably my guy, followed by Superman.
So you're a pretty big fan of Mr. Griffin's Homer this year.
Oh yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. You're right around the
does a
corner
great
from him.
Homer.
So
He does a great Homer. I don't know how. No one's gonna beat that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, I think Superman, Batman. But we all love superheroes, and I think there's something implicit that God placed in us as men, that we want to be the protectors. We want to be the people that people look to. But sometimes we try to do that without the Savior, right?
And you honestly, I think something that I've realized in my life, and I'm sure, you know, it's something that we spoke about in your class as well again, but, you know, we can go throughout life and think, oh, we're the man. We got this, right? And it's at those high points when you kind of start to move away from your faith a little bit, and you're like, I got this. I can handle everything on my own. You get slapped in the face every time. When
Thank
start
you
to
for
take
bringing that up.
mentality.
It's a great point.
That to me is one of the biggest
That's a
points
great
with
point.
adult men, because and even as fathers, okay. Because here's the thing: we think that if we don't know something, we can't do something. It renders us inefficient or weak.
Yep.
And I think we as men, we've got this "I got this" attitude, and even when we don't got this, and I think we have to. And if you look at here's the comparison I make. You know, superheroes need Superman or kryptonite, right?
Yeah.
Kryptonite weakens him, okay? He needs to go back to his fortress of solitude. Our fortress of solitude, and I mean this, is God. And if we can't be humble enough to recognize we need God, we're going to fall. And that's a great point. And even as a parent, one of the toughest things as a parent for me has been with daughters. I never had, you know, sisters growing up. Is when I've been a little bit too hard or whatever, is to admit that I'm wrong. It's to admit that I'm wrong. And because if we feel that we admit that, somehow it takes our power away. What I have found, at least with daughters, I don't know if it's true with sons, what I have found with daughters is that not only doesn't take my power away, that actually gives me more, for lack of a better word, power in their eyes. And so for me personally, I want my kids to know that I don't think I'm perfect, that I'm not God, that I need God. And so I don't, like, they're 21 and 19 now, but what I do now when I go to confession, I don't say, come on, you're coming with me. I tell them I'm going to confession. You want to come? Because I want them to see that I don't think I'm God. I know I'm not God. I'm going to God because I need strengthening, to be a better parent sometimes.
So how do you, in those moments, how do you let go and trust God?
That's a very.
I know that's the hardest loaded
That's
question
the
I can ask.
yeah.
But
I'm still working on it.
Uh-huh.
Still to this day, even as good as God has been to me,
Mhm.
I still don't trust Him
Mhm.
as much as I should.
Yep.
And finally, I've come to a point in time in my life. My prayer life used to be this: God, here's my issue, and here's what you need to do to fix it. You need to do A, B, C, and D. Okay, fix this.
Yeah.
Okay, this is how I want you to fix it, and this is how I want you to fix that. And finally, I had my spiritual advisor, much wiser than I am. He said, Paul, don't you think he knows how to fix it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I've gotten to the point where I've said, I'm giving you my life.
Mhm.
I'm just going to give it to you.
Mhm.
And I have found there's a great liberation with that. And I'm not always good at it, trust me.
Yeah.
But there's a great liberation with that, and recognizing. And by doing that, I've been able to see, okay, now I've seen God act in my daughter's life. Now I don't have to worry about this so much. It's a very liberating thing to lift my fears instead of laying awake at night and think, okay, what's going to happen with my daughter for this? What's going to happen for that? It's a liberating thing. So what I've tried to do is I've given it up to the Holy Spirit, give it up to God, and say, and it's a lifelong process.
Mhm.
Okay, you're not going to get over it.
We don't have this planned
Yeah.
out right now.
It really
Yeah.
is a lifelong process, and so I'm still learning.
Mhm.
So.
Mr. Frass has a great, and this is the last thing I'll say on the topic, but Mr. Frass has a fantastic motto and mentality that he taught us freshman year, and I think that it's helped me a lot in my life at certain times. It's been kind of a struggle, which is live now, not I, but God within me. Because
I'm going to steal that.
You're gonna steal that?
Frass,
Okay.
is that okay
Mr.
if I steal that?
Frass, steal that.
He's a good buddy of mine. We go
Yeah.
see movies and baseball games and stuff. So yeah.
and that's something. I don't know if you ever had him,
Yeah, no.
but that was something that
I definitely wouldn't say.
he always told us.
I love it.
And Jesus, make me a fond of your grace, right? And that's another thing that I don't know if he told us that or if you did or whatever. Somewhere along the lines we heard that, but
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Yeah.
So you said you struggled a little bit with your relationship with God as a police officer, and you started to get that cloud of doubt. And I feel like doubt is honestly inevitable and a very important thing, because doubt helps you go and question things, and without that questioning, you can never grow, and then you're just blindly following, right? So what helped you get out of that doubt, and also what habits have you made to help build up your faith to what it is today?
Well, in fact, I think it was St. Augustine that said that doubt is another element of faith. So that's very true. I used to think that my faith was about having it all together, having all the questions, and being always on fire for God. That's not realistic. It's not even realistic in any relationship. And so for me, what did it for me was meeting with a friend of mine at the police department, and we started to talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary and some of her messages in Medjugorje, some of her messages in Fatima. And we started to read those messages, and then I started to pray the rosary. The rosary is really what really honestly brought me, Mary Alma Mater brought me back to my faith. And I started a prayer regimen where prayer became a regular habit. If I'm being honest, prayer is not as regular of a habit now as it was back then. But I became a more prayerful person through that. So I was praying the rosary pretty regularly. I would go to Eucharistic adoration. I would pray from the Pieta book. For those of you familiar with this, there are Pieta prayers that you pray. But then what I found was that I still didn't trust God. I was going to pay God back for all the good that He'd shown me and being merciful to me. So now I was going to do all these prayers, and I was going to spend an hour a day. And if I didn't do that, so it was a prideful thing that my relationship with God depended upon me. And I came to the realization that it doesn't just depend upon me. I had a priest finally tell me, why don't you just let God love you? And just recognize that you're never going to pay God back. You're never going to be more generous than God is with us. And so that regular prayer life, and it's still a regular prayer life, but not as often with kids and the family. So I would say regular prayer for me. I pray the rosary, if not daily, fairly regularly. I spend time in the chapel regularly. And it helps me recognize that I need to remain humble. humility is really not. It's not self-deprecating attitude. It's just being honest with ourselves and recognizing, I'm not the man.
Yeah.
I'm not the man. I may be the man at work for 8 hours a day as a police officer, but when I come home, I'm just dad. And I think if officers can realize that, if teachers can realize that, if husbands and fathers can realize that, I think it's that humility is the number one thing that keeps us connected with God, and God keeps us humble.
I think one of my favorite, things that I've watched over the years is, you'll see some of these actors, you'll see some of these celebrities, these people that on the surface look like they have it all figured out. And they'll be the first people to show up at a school, talk to a group of kids for free. They'll be the first people. Nick Saban, who we just had here this week, right? He's a fantastic example of somebody that is at the top of his game, but is never too proud, never too confident in himself, not to step back and go meet with, a high school in Michigan, right? Far away from Alabama, far away from Tuscaloosa, where he's the king. And I think that, when you see that, when you see somebody that's on the top of their game step back, and it happens with police work all the time. They'll visit schools, they'll go to community events and such. When you see that in people that are so deeply passionate about giving back and supporting, I think that's where you find God. I think that, when you can look in the mirror and say, I know that I'm this person, but I'm not this person, right? I'm blessed to be that way, but that's not, at the end of the day, who I am. And I think that that's a really, really special place to find yourself.
Yeah, that's really good.
One of the GDK homeroom assemblies we had in the chapel, Mr. White talked about always have that blessed mindset.
Yeah.
So you got to always see yourself as, even though you might not be having a great day, you're still blessed, And it's okay to have bad days and good, but those good days really fulfill you. So.
That is very wise advice. I honestly, guys, I've been in a couple different schools. We really do have a very good theology department here. We really do. Have a lot of people here. And I think that's great advice. I think being thankful, living a life of thankfulness helps us recognize. And I think connecting with God helps us to do that. It helps me live in the spirit when I tend to want to live in the flesh. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And it's funny, you mentioned the police department. One of the things I want to mention that my wife and I made a purposeful decision on is I didn't want to just hang out with cops. Because the tendency is you think that when you hang out with cops, everybody's a thief. You don't trust anybody. Everybody's a jerk, right? And so we started to hang out with our church friends. Well, unfortunately, sometimes the pendulum swing back the other way. Everybody's honest. Everybody's good. We trust everybody. Let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Well, now that's not necessarily accurate too. I think if I'm going to err, though, I'm going to err on the side of that because it gives me hope that what I saw at the police department was not the norm. 90% of the calls went to 10% of the people, but that wasn't the norm. And so it gave me hope to hang out with, the people that were good. And both Mr. Zabik and I he's sooner retired than I was. We talk about it all the time, how blessed we are to be in such a Catholic Christian environment where everybody is upheld and everybody we're all shooting for the same thing. And it's a real blessing.
Have you gotten any car chases as a highway patrol?
Yes, I have. I got chases today are different than they were. See them in Hollywood. I think today most officers are cognizant of other damage that can happen, collateral damage, and so different departments have different policies. I can't remember what our policy was, but basically it was, if I remember correctly. I think it was, if it's not a felony, just don't chase.
Don't chase.
Because the worst thing would be, you cause a chase over a traffic violation, somebody gets killed. So, and that's tough. As a young man, you have that adrenaline going, right?
Like, I want
to get there, And so I would always say, most officers would probably agree with me. The first 5 years as a police officer, you try to get into as much crap as you can. The last 20. Try to stay out of it. So,
how did you, because I've watched a fair bit of live PD and On Patrol Live and stuff, and how did you? They always say is the pursuing officer in a case like that, because of the adrenaline, they don't allow them to make the arrest because they don't want there to be any, issue. How do you step back, tone yourself down for a second and say, I need to handle this like a man. I need to walk up there. I can't walk up there screaming. I can't walk up there. And it's a challenge. How do you in those moments step back and make that choice?
Well, to be quite blunt with you, that what has helped that are the cameras. Cameras in the car, because there's accountability. Nobody wants to be on the 6 o'clock news or doing something that you're already doing. People don't realize that there's a big adrenaline rush, and people say, well, officers should know better. Well, there's a lot of things officers should do, but when you have that adrenaline going, sometimes you can do things that you don't want to do. And so I think for me, my faith helped me to do that. It helped me to kind of equalize myself. So when you get into those scenarios, you're not trying to take that extra shot or do those extra things that ultimately officers are going to get themselves in trouble for. The other thing that helped me was, prior to kind of getting more into my faith, when people would cause issues and problems, you always want to lash back out at them, right? But when you pull that Christianity back into there, what I found was oftentimes that would help me take a little bit extra time talking to somebody. And, more than once, that would work. Sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes they're just going to do what they want to do. But oftentimes it would work. Just spending that extra time looking at someone's eyes and treating them with that dignity that maybe they hadn't seen. Sometimes that helps.
Have you ever seen a miracle take place either in the classroom or in the field, and something maybe not a miracle is the right word for it, but something that you look at this and it's extraordinary that God's hands were kind of part of it?
Well, I could tell you about one. It was my maybe if he sees this, my former lieutenant captain. After I left there, I knew that he had contracted it was lymphoma. I think it was stage 3 lymphoma. So I got some holy water from Lourdes, called him up and said, hey, can I pay you a visit? So I went out there and gave it to him. We prayed together. He gave it to him. And then about a month later, he calls me on the phone. He was still at the police department. And he was all choked up. He said, can I tell you something? I said, yeah. He said, I went for my scan recently, and the doctor said, I think I'm looking at the wrong chart. Can I? So he came back and he said, did you get any medical procedures done? He said, no, I haven't had anything done. He said, I think this is wrong. This has got to be a mistake. He went back and looked at it. He says, your tumor shrank by over half.
Wow.
And that's inexplicable. I think that was a miracle.
That's beautiful.
I think miracles happen every single day, but the shroud of the world, we just don't see them. I can't think of anything else offhand that happened on duty. I can think of one thing. So I pulled the car over one day, and there was a guy across the street in a industrial size mower, and I didn't think anything of it. And I walked up to the car, and something said to me, you know what? There's something that's going to happen here. So I took my time walking up to the car, and as I walked up to the car, all of a sudden I heard this boom. The industrial size mower shot out a jagged rock about this big, that went right in front of me, through the guy's car completely, through the metal.
Wow.
If that thing had hit me,
Yeah, but done.
So yeah,
That's amazing.
things like that.
Yeah, I think.
So I looked at that. The guy thought he got shot.
Yeah.
And he was like, "What the heck happened?" I looked down. And there's this thing. So I think things like that happen.
Yep.
I think as Catholic Christians, sometimes we underestimate the suffering and the tragedy that we avoid because of God's providence, that we never even realize, because we focus on the things that we do have to go through. And I really think, and I've said this on retreat, I've said this in the classroom. I'll give you a quote from Father Fulton, who I think is a very wise priest, who I think this is a great quote. Sometimes God saves us from our suffering, and sometimes God saves us through our suffering. Very, very, very wise quote, and I've taken that to heart ever since I heard it.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Are you very aware of your surroundings now that you have all this experience?
Yeah, when my wife, when I go to a restaurant, I never sit with my back to the door.
Like at parties, are you always looking at exits and stuff?
Yeah, I am. And people ask me, as a retired officer, I can carry a concealed weapon. I don't.
Okay.
I don't out of respect of the school. I don't
Right.
here, obviously, but I don't carry it often because my main thing is that I want to. The last thing I want to do is involved in an off-duty shooting. And generally speaking, if someone wants my wallet, here you go. Someone wants my car, take it. The only time I would carry a weapon is to save a life. So I've carried it before when I'm with my family, when we go to different areas. And there was a couple years ago when there seemed to be some church shootings going on. And when that happened, I'd carry it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that weapons make our world safer? Or do you think that they make it more of a dangerous place?
Well, I think we live in a culture that seeks to put a Band-Aid on the symptom rather than the problem. We just, in theology class, we were just talking about Jesus' words. If you are angry with your brother, you've committed murder in your heart. If you are lust after a woman, you've committed murder in your heart. And I asked the guys, wow, everybody in this room is screwed.
Yeah.
Because every single one of us has committed that. Not a single person hasn't done that. What do you suppose he means by that? I think here's what he means. That when I show these murders in class, by the time that murder happens, that's already happened in that guy's heart. You don't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to kill someone. You don't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to commit adultery on my wife. It begins with angst and anger in your heart and lust. So the point I think Christ is trying to make is, let's look at the heart of the problem. What's in our heart? Our culture doesn't do that. Okay? Agree or disagree with the gun issue, they're trying to put a Band-Aid on the guns rather than looking at the angst and anger and distrust and hatred that begins in our hearts.
Yes.
And that's what the culture does. Well, we'll look good to everybody because we're trying to pass all these laws. Now, I'm not saying that we give guns out to teenagers or we give guns out to kids and things like that, because we do live in a different culture today that is leavened with a lot of stuff that goes on in social media. So I do think we have to have some common sense with that. But at the same time, if we take a look at families and the denigration of the family, it is directly commensurate with all this violence that's going on. And if you talk to most officers, they would probably agree with that.
Do you think that there's a cynicism in our world, with people and with life and the respect of life today?
I do believe there's a cynicism. I think that it's directly correlated to the absence of God in our collective conscience. If my life is just mine and God is out of the equation, I can do whatever I want with it.
Yeah.
But if my life is valuable, which is part of our discussion with God, it's valuable because God gave it to me, then it means something more.
Yeah.
Exactly. We were just talking about the whole idea of euthanasia in the classroom just recently. And I asked the students, I said, okay, what is the world's view of life? They came up with selfish, self-centered, expendable. And I said, what is God's view of life? We're connected. I told them a story about, my grandmother, who I think was a saint, okay? And so when she contracted cancer when I was in college, I thought, God's going to take her because she's not going to have to suffer because she's a good person. But what I found, that wasn't the case. She lasted for a while. And I was struggling with this, and I asked a priest friend of mine, I said, I have a tough time with this. He says, here's what my advice to you. Next time you're at your grandparents' house, watch your grandfather. And I'm like, what does that mean? Now, my grandfather, he was a good person, but he was someone that never really showed a lot of compassion. And here's what I noticed. He was feeding her, he was changing her bed sheets, he was getting her medication. He was becoming someone that, had it not been for her suffering, he never would have become. And I think that's what it means to be connected and not cynical. In our culture today, in our throwaway culture today, well, she's suffering, just put her to death, right? But ultimately, because we're all connected, I believe because she was a saint, she ended up help sanctifying her husband. And if we're connected like that, if we're connected with our faith, we look at suffering in a different way, and not as cynical, right, as we would without it.
Yeah, you can really grow through your suffering, and I feel like when you're in that situation, you can either choose to go the path of, oh, I'm putting this aside and I'm just gonna sulk in sadness, or you can go
Hey, listen,
through it.
push through it.
Hey, as long as I'm suffering, why not get credit
Exactly.
for it?
Like,
Yeah.
No,
push
come
through it.
on,
Yeah.
get some extra credit.
I found too with like a lot of suffering too, and I've obviously not faced some of the severe suffering that a lot of people out there have, but I've found that when I can take that and I can turn it into something good for somebody else, it makes the suffering a lot lighter.
It does.
Mhm.
It does. And I think a lot of times today, sometimes the tendency is, I've got friends that have kids and maybe have stopped going to church, and I have a very wise friend who I went to the seminary with, who's he's great kids, but he says, my kids haven't encountered enough suffering to need God yet.
Yeah.
And sometimes, unfortunately, that's where I'm my own God, everything's going well. I would rather get God so that I don't need him down the road.
Right.
So.
It'll flip pretty fast, and I think that's what our culture's found. So, well, Mr. Stu, it's been a real pleasure, and we really appreciate
I'm honored.
having
I'm
you
very
on.
honored.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
honored that you would even
Thank
ask
you
me. Thank you so
for,
much.
Thank you for your
Appreciate
time.
it.
So,
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.